Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I'll do it all professionally and then we can have a chat at the end as well. I mean, I say professionally. This book, it tells of a heresy tale, one of 60 you may have heard of space marines, are they good or bad? It's hard to tell, will we ever find out? Dan is here to explain, let's talk about Hello, Dan, and welcome back again to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for inviting me back to talk to you again. I can't believe you were still prepared to put up with me rabbiting away.
I mean, no, I mean, always. And this is going to be a shorter conversation than our normal ones because it's a short story and it's in
Yes.
Age of Darkness, Heresy Book 16. And
Hmm.
it's Little Horus, which I don't know anything before I open the cover of these books. So I was delighted that we get to go back to the Mournival. I have to say, most of the book to that point is really depressing shit as heresy rolls out and you'll see
Yes.
impact on the ground and how all the creeping dread and, you know, hope is being slowly quashed.
Hmm.
But I do think Little Horus, and I don't know if it's because it's of the moment or spring is coming, but I do think this is it might be my favorite story of all of them so far. And
Thank you.
I, it's, if I'm being really honest, it's probably 80% of that reason is the literary shenanigans going on in the story. So I know you were quite keen to chat about Little Horace because you love it for your own reasons.
I do, yeah, yeah. It's one of those things that I was just asked to do. Christian asked me to do it, and I thought, oh, that'd be a fun thing to do. Now, obviously, in the story, it is advancing some of the backstory because it's touching on things like various things like the White Scars and Iron Warriors and stuff like that. There's lurking in the background, so it's not like separating itself from continuity, but it's much, much more um, character based. It is almost a character portrait of a character that had been there from day one, essentially, that I always thought was quite fun. And I wanted a little bit of space to talk about him more
Yeah.
and all those sorts of things. So that's why I really, really liked it. And yes, it is one of my favorites too. It's one I loved writing. I love the fact that it sort of stayed the course. Some of the things in it and some of the things that I say about him in there pay off hugely later. I mean, it is surprisingly load bearing as a story. It's not just a sort of little aside,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's been also, I think, quite influential. I know that I know some of the other authors looked at it and went, "Oh, we should do things like that about some of the other characters we've created to give them more substance and everything."
Mm. I mean, I was aware as I was reading it, and there were things like the sword is named, it's so Mournival, and then he names the sword after a riff on Mournival.
Hmm.
Someone said to me, well, Mira, you need to keep an eye on that sword because the sword
Yeah.
pop
Oh,
up.
you do.
And I was like, holy shit balls. Like, and then, I mean, obviously, you have the other characters popping in and out. So and I often think, Ian always said to me, Mira, you're coming the wrong way at this. You're missing, if were into 40K, you'd be dying because of all the Easter eggs. But I think it's going to be quite cool when I discover it the other way around as well.
I think so. Yes.
So yeah, what's that sword called? I want to get this in the video. Don't worry, I'll edit this bit and it will have me saying it
Well, I
immediately.
feel now I should have my copy with me now. So,
Mourn it all. Mourn it
well,
all. It's
Monitor,
called.
yes.
Yeah. So I mean, uh, one of the I will tell you why I really loved this. So when I was reading it, there were so many, and I don't know if this is just Dan in your brain, but so many. I'm sure if we went to a university, they'd break it down and say, well, this is a literary conceit that was probably picked up and da 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 da. So one of the things is the whole story reminds me of a haiku. And
Right.
loads of seasonal imagery. It feels very, very poetic. And we have the repetition, which
Hmm.
we saw in uh we saw in the the Wolves novel with the
Hmm.
repetition of the dream. So that's a
Hmm.
little bit of a lovely trope that comes back,
Yeah.
but really resonates in this story because, of course, little Horace is feeling the presence of someone or something around him, a ghost.
Hmm.
So little Horace describes himself as autumn because he's always been told, "Oh, you're melancholy." And he
Hmm.
says, "No, no, no. The melancholic humor is protean. It possesses the quality of autumn. It's transformative, the accelerator of death, the enabler of ends and beginnings." And I was like, okay. And then he chats a little bit later. He says, "The mechanism always worked." Axeman pressed, dropping his soft voice to a leaf rustle whisper, like autumn leaves in the wind.
Oh, it's like I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, and then he describes somebody, Cigar Targos is heartwood like us. So you've
Mhm.
got the wood and the trees in there. And then there's another quote where he's describing something, and it's described as like branches and twigs. And I'm like, how are you getting away with this? Because it is really beautiful and poetic. Did you have a notion that this was going to come across? I mean, at the beginning, it's a storyteller, it's a narrator. Let me tell you
Mm,
of Little Horace.
mm.
Did you know that that was going to be?
I think I did. It's difficult because it is a while ago, but I think first of all, what I wanted to do was to slightly replicate the sort of tone and style of Horus Rising with that the sort of I was there, that the telling of the story within the
Yeah,
story, the remembrance, the thing, and to increase that legend. I also wanted to do something that in a positive way put a sort of softness into the Lunar Wolves and obviously what they become because they are otherwise so ferocious. And
Mm,
I like the idea that there was a kind of sophisticated that sort of almost noble scholar warrior thing going on that I thought we've got to show this because the character is such a sort of he's literally the little version of Horus. He's
yeah.
sort of he looks like him. He shares the genetics so that he looks like him. Hence his nickname and all this kind of stuff. I wanted to give him that sort of um quality to because in some respects he's the least of those four at the beginning in Horus Rising. He's the least of them. Sort of you've got the Abaddon being incredibly warlike. You've got Torgadon being sort of the beloved one, who's sort of the friendly Porthos who embraces everybody. You got Loken is the outsider, but he's clearly the heroic. And then you've got the other one, and the other one is the sort of Horus copy, and everybody sort of rags on him a bit, because
Mm,
yet he is an incredibly experienced warrior, and he's got this, so he's almost got that sort of what's it called? Chip on his shoulder about wanting to be as great as them, and we
yeah,
start to see more of that. And I thought the best way of handling that is to treat him with enormous respect, and I mean, I don't know if I thought to myself, I want to be poetic, but I did want to have that sort of idea that it was structured like a kind of a legend or a myth that is told with the repetitions in it and
yeah.
picking up on the imagery for those who want to pick up on the imagery and the seasonal things and all those kind of things, because I think that gave him a sort of not a gravitas, but it gave him a seriousness that up to that
Yeah.
point maybe he'd slightly lacked.
And it gives him a place in the saga. It places him.
Oh boy, it does.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. I mean, and I loved the fact that he's a baby. He's not a baby. He's a little Horus. And then when he's talking to Horus, Horus sees straight through him. So
Hmm.
there's this beautiful conversation where Big Horus says to Little Horus, "Oh, I notice you've picked people with the same face as you for your new
Hmm.
Mournival. And is that because you were trying to forget someone else's face?"
Yes.
And I was like, the reveal was just, oh,
Yes, and if you like that, absolutely no spoilers, but when you get to Saturnine and the end and the death, it's gonna blow your mind if you've enjoyed it that much.
hooray!
That's what I meant about that story being low bearing. It's not. It's a weird thing because when I wrote the story, I know as I did when I was writing things like the Lightning Tower, I knew that I was setting up things that I wanted to use later, and
Yes.
that actually it was that for a short story, it was doing an awful lot of carrying of stuff just to keep it going. But also at the same time, when you get years later, literally years later, you get to write these big novels that are closing off the saga, and you're going back and like, what have I forgotten? What do I know? And I went, oh my God, it's all there. I'd sort of forgotten, and
Oh,
therefore connected things that would have been connected because I would have done my job properly. But sort of coming fresh to it, sitting down, and like I said, to write write my bits of the Siege of Terror, for instance, I was going, right, what are my raw materials? What are the threads I mustn't forget about? What were the things I was setting up last time? And I read back through various different things, not just mine, but from other people. And I got to that story and I went, oh, of course, that's what I was
yeah.
thinking of however many years ago. Of course, all of these things. And
Oh,
they pay off in
in droves.
yes, in ways that I was going, oh well, like sort of, because I was also and I can't be the only one of us who does this, but every time during the Horus Heresy that I was asked to write a novel or a short story, my obviously there was a big concern to make sure that it fitted into everything else and that everything worked together as a unit, which is the whole point of doing a big series like that. But I also wanted to make sure each novel, each short story was its own thing that you
Yeah.
could dip in and go, I enjoyed reading that
Mm.
without having to necessarily know everything else because that's it.
Yeah.
But I also did at the back of my mind, weirdly, from a very early stage, and it lasted until I got to the end of the death. I was going, I am assuming that there are readers out there, and there are, but I
Mm.
am assuming there are readers out there who, like me as a writer, have been invested in this since the beginning, and they are reading their way through it, and they are remembering stuff like somebody who like devotedly watches a TV show and go, oh, then in season 3 this happens, and that's a
Yeah.
callback to that because that is great when it happens inside that structure, and that's the whole point of writing it. So to be able to get them to a point where I was with elements of that story and others where I was going, oh, now that gets to pay off finally.
Mm.
I bet that imaginary reader in my mind is going to be so delighted to see that
Yeah,
because it delights me.
it's going to be a stand up out of your chair moment where you're like, what? And it's so, yeah. I mean, we rely
Yeah.
on you for that now. I mean, it's fantastic. And I think for me, like I really this did capture Little Horace as having main character energy. So the way
Yes.
he was written as the hero at the center of the story was fantastic because he had the frailty and the confidence and the chutzpah, but also the doubt, the little bits of doubt and looking
Oh, yeah.
conscience. So it was fantastic. And
I I think it's very interesting you call it main character energy because it is. He's almost like the main character who's never allowed to be a main character. I'm reminded of that very funny moment in which one is it? It's one of the Thor movies. It's Love. Is it Love and Thunder? Where he's with the Guardians and there's a shot looking at the Guardians and then Thor leans in and smiles to sort of eclipse them because it's his movie. And I always feel that a little bit about Little Horus is that obviously Loken and Abaddon particularly, Torgan to a certain extent, they are main players in
mm,
the mechanisms of where all this stuff is going. And he's just he's like also starring, and he's going, I should be also starring, and he's like leaning into shot every now and then, going, but look at me, I'm this
yeah.
guy, and
Well,
they.
I mean, I think he could be a franchise stealer if he had the opportunity. But that it's really, really brilliant, and it's really stuck with me. And I think one of the big impacts it made on me is it feels quite dreamlike and surreal as you're going through this story. But the battles are so beautifully written. I mean, as you know, I hate a battle thing, but just the writing is like really attractive. It's like very compelling. I've got a couple of examples. This, just to read at you again is, keep it awkward. Dry air, cool, a faint hint of salt, the Sea of Enna in the flat Rift Valley below like a sheet of glass in a culvert. Along its shore, the teeming city of Tijun, collected like flotsam, like multicolored shingle. On the far side of the immense valley, across the back of the sleeping sea, the block line of the opposite valley wall squared off and velvet black in the dawn light. The sky was violet, shot with stars and occasional moons. To the north, the pre-glow of rising sun. To the east, the false dawn of the port on fire since midnight. That was the handiwork of Gerard and 13th Company. So you're giving us really gorgeous, romantic, dreamlike description. And then we learn about the enemy who have little cocoons that when they
Mhm.
go inside, it's lit up and colored. I'm like, this is beautiful. I'm imagining these lamps coming up. And then, he, of course, they have to go in and completely kick the shit out of them all. So, little Horus figures out I can just chop them all down. He kicked the other backwards, crunching man and energy cocoon into the anti-hall wall. The impact grazed the stone and caused chips to fly out. And then the compulsory was pinned there for a second, like an insect specimen on a felt pad, his body shield flickering and blinking as it shorted out. So we've got the beauty of the description mixed with this haiku nature,
Mhm.
cocoon, butterfly, life, death, pinned out, all in.
Yeah.
It's all happening. So I was just really picking up potentially more than I should have done. I'm just going to read you a couple more because close to tears on a couple of these. He drove the Medusan war leader back across the carpet of ancient pulverized glass and mummified scraps. His next blow wounded Henricos in the thigh. Something silvery, like liquid mercury, sobbed out. We got Mercury tears. And then, I mean, this is a girl who hates it. Blood splattered the floor and pooled around crumpled figures and broken weapons. Bloody handprints marked the edges of the fountain bowl, where men had struggled to prop themselves up as their last breaths escaped. On the intricately carved walls, jets of blood had left long, pressure pattern arcs, huge horsetail fans, or fern frond spatters, some stretched 5 or 6 meters up the sheer walls. It's just so, there's a different vibe. It's not gruesome, it's beautiful, Dan. So, where does that come from? How does this story get that different sense of fighting?
Where does that come from? And that comes probably from a desire that is both conscious and subconscious in me, in that I know that whenever I've written an awful lot of 40K and Horus Heresy, I mean, probably too much,
Too much.
so much of it, there is obligatory, it's not just obligatory action, you've got to get the action in there, but that's what the whole thing is about. We're talking about a martial society, we're talking about wars, we're talking about, all sorts of killing and destruction. And I am aware, because I've done so much of it, that there is a danger that it's just going to get repetitive.
Yeah.
How do you describe what are the things that you can vary in those situations so that it's not like the reader's not going, oh yes, another action scene. It's a bit like that action scene in that other story, and it becomes increasingly difficult to find ways of reframing things so that happens, so that you've got various levers you can pull.
Yeah.
And I've started to pull them all more deliberately, and some of them more drastically, so much so that they've snapped off, and I've had to build a new lever. But it's like in the Gaunt's Ghost series, as an example, the infantry battles, and then you go, okay, what can okay, I've done some of those, and you get 2 or 3 novels in, you're going, what can I do now? I can increase the scale, so it's a large scale infantry battle, or it's a siege, or it's we can go small scale and have a little recon party, and they get into, oh yeah, okay, I've done that. And then it's like, okay, what other elements of warfare or climate or weather conditions or blah can I do to make sure that this doesn't feel like something I've written in a previous book? And you start doing that, and then you start thinking, okay, I can play around with those. So I can then play around with point of view. I can play around with perspective. I can play around with various other things like that. But I can also play around with, if you like, the tonal qualities. And actually, when we do get to talk about, particularly talk about Saturnine, which is obviously in years to come, when we get to talk about that, that's a really good example. There are examples in there where I've got to the action sequences, gone, right, what do I do with this one to make sure it's not the same as the other one, and really deliberately just frame it. It's like it's not like putting it into a different gear. It's like getting into a different vehicle and going, right, this one's going to be like this,
Yeah.
and that's going to sustain all the way through this passage. So that actually, in some respects, that short story is a very good example of me deliberately going, how can I do the stuff in here that in some respects is the same as stuff we've seen in other places, in a way that will be arresting, and people go, oh, that's a bit different. And and although I was doing it long before I got to that short story, it is a great example of my own learning curve about going, right, I've got to do this, this, and this, or I'm going to do this, this, and this. What can I do to make that not feel like the other things that it's done? So that you're actually seeing, I don't know, dare I use the word process, but you're seeing my process evolving, where I'm going, how can I handle this? And it's not just Space Marine hits other Space Marine falls down, then this, what can I do that is different to there? So there are, and this is true of non-battle and action scenes, obviously, but it applies particularly to action scenes because they are so common in this kind of fiction that we're doing.
Yeah.
Is that you go into it thinking how, like I said, how am I going to adjust all the different dials? And it's like a mixing desk. What am I going to? I'm going to have a lot more of that, a lot less of that. I'm going to do this. I'm going to switch the tense over, like all of these things to play around with to go. So I want this in itself to be memorable, and it may just be very, very simple things like where it is happening, an unusual place that it's happening, an unusual whatever. And sometimes, and I'm just discovering that at the moment in the book, sometimes it's like you turn all of them off and you go back to absolute default. This is just an account. And that in itself has a sort of shock value because you go, oh my God, it's almost matter of fact. And that makes it more chilling. So you can go right up there with the tone and style and go, I'm going to write poetry, which happens to be violent. Or at the other end of this is you go, I'm going to write it like it's an eyewitness account of this happens and then this happens, and anywhere in between those things to give it its own flavor. So that I would hate the idea of a reader going, oh my God, another battle, or oh my God, another conversation. I want each thing to have its own.
Wow. Well, I think the reader, we certainly benefit. And because this is happening subconsciously in the movie studio that is your brain, the choice to kind of have this kind of abstract kind of poetry flowing through really echoes the melancholy, the character that little Horus sees of himself.
That is, yes, because that's the other thing that's worth. I mean, I think it's obvious, but it's worth pointing out is that when I do a fight sequence in a story or a novel, and I'm sitting there at that imaginary mixing desk, working out all the different variables that I'm going to set for it. The other thing that I'm always bearing in mind is what is appropriate to the story I'm telling, because. So in that is a particularly good example where the sound balance, if you like, of the fighting was absolutely in step with what the story was about. And sometimes you want it to be out of step so it jars, but you don't want it to be out of step arbitrarily so it feels incongruous.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? It's so yes, I think very much I was in that kind of samurai mindset of the sort of poetic warrior, and therefore all the imageries of autumn and blossom and all these sorts of things was like, yes, that, I mean, it's not that, but that was the vibe, and therefore that helped me determine how those action sequences should be portrayed.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. I mean, the samurai thing and the whole sword, and having to be in close combat and seeing each other face to face, I thought there were so many close encounters. I thought that was really lovely. And I remember you told us how you can bring your camera right into the front,
Yes.
So I appreciated that.
But you can also track your camera so far away you're no longer in the same room. And as I say, I've just been discovering that it's probably not the first time I've done it, but I've just written a really, really strong action sequence in the last couple of weeks, where I was thinking, how am I going to do this? Because it's really going to have a lot of impact. And I ended up deciding to stage it so we do not see it. We only hear it.
Wow.
And we hear it from the point of view of people who can't get there.
Oh my goodness.
And I think it's weirdly chilling to hear these things happening, and they're not quite sure because they can't see it properly, and they're having to guess what's happening and all this kind of stuff. But so yes, going in really, really close is obviously some of the most powerful stuff you can do, particularly in that kind of close combat thing. But actually going a long way away to it's almost like I was about to use the word Shakespearean, and I don't mean that in terms of the quality of the writing, but that kind of Macbeth moment where they haven't got the cast or staging to be able to show the whole battle. So somebody goes in, my lord, this has just happened. And they go, has it? Yes. and then deliver something where you go, oh, I can see it in my head. Do you know what I mean?
When you say stuff like that, I think he could be talking about writing for the Warhammer TV series if he's thinking about budget and cameras.
Could be.
Pandemonium, like he could be talking about.
I couldn't possibly be drawn on that. Except weirdly, I often think about it, and I think this is an interesting way of doing it actually. And it's weird because it's not essential. But when I'm writing a novel, the only budgetary concern is what they pay me to write a novel and deliver it to them on time. Sometimes I do think about the budget in terms of what I'm doing with my special effects and my staging and stuff like that, and sometimes deliberately that is like, I'm going to put a lot of money into this because I want to see it as big as possible. But sometimes
Yeah.
I'm going to go, what would be the cool, creepy, low budget vibe? How would you do this if it was a bottle episode of a TV show and you didn't want to spend a lot, and then find the drama that's inherent in that
Yeah.
to push it back the other way. And so you go, you don't need to see these things. You just need to experience them or sense them
Mm.
somehow in a way that communicates what's happened to you. So it could just be, like I said, it could be somebody at a distance hearing it over a Voxnet, or it could be getting very close in, so you don't need to see the back. All of those sorts of
Yeah.
things. Like I said, there's almost an infinite number of things you can play around with to write the same scene in so many
Yeah.
different ways. And you've got to work out which one's going to be best, what's going to be different, what's going to be feel fresh, and also what's going to get the point of the story across. I have
Oh,
rambled too much again.
love it. Love it. No, it's all good. I mean, there will be people going, why didn't you ask him about this event that happened on this planet and so and so? Sorry about that, everybody. You know that's what you don't come to this channel for. So as you know, I really hate being grossed out, but this event happened. I didn't realize it was happening in the book till it had happened. And I just sat there blinking, thinking it was astonishingly amazing. I'd never read anything like it. His third blow caught Little Horus vertically at the cheek in a line that began just over the right eyepiece where his mournival mark was displayed. Amazing detailing, because that's a lovely little moon. The bonded ceramite of his helm didn't even seem to stop the Medusan weapon. Axelman fell. There was a great deal of blood suddenly, and he couldn't properly account for its source. He saw something on the etched steel floor in front of him. It was the visor and snout section of his own helmet, the entire faceplate. It had been sheared off, peeled cleanly away as though shaved by an industrial slicer, and it was not empty. And but because you know from the beginning it says, after they replaced his face, it didn't look the
Nice.
same.
Mm.
And before you realize what would happen, that was how he realized his face had been cut off. And again, the samurai thing and the emphasis on the sword and, it happening in that moment. I wasn't grossed out at all. I just thought this is some of the best writing I've ever, read. And I think it was the grotesque and the horror of it, but matched with your poetic, dreamlike prowess, the style that you'd chosen. And I just thought that was fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about taking Little Horace's face off. And you've
Well,
got form with this because poor Eisenhorn, he can't smile. So
he cannot.
there's
No,
and
no.
there's a lot around the power of faces. Like Horace points out, you want the others in your new Mournival to look like you so you can
Mm.
forget about what you've done to others. And of course, Horace being echoed within all the Legion. So is that like canon that little Horace was going to lose his face? Is that something we learn about?
That is well, it is absolutely canon in as much as that's what we wrote into it. That character was my creation, and that's where I was going with it, and that's what I wove into the legend of what was going on. It seemed appropriate. I think it's interesting you cite Eisenhower not famously in, I think it's the first book, not the first book, the second.
Dinos.
Yes, he gets his face paralyzed during a torture session, so that he from that point on cannot express
Mm,
facial expression. And I just thought that was a comment on his incredibly grim outlook on everything, that actually even when he was happy you couldn't tell it. And that was, he'd be through that device he becomes a sort of embodiment of the darkness, of the grim darkness of the future. Is that it's like, he's never going to smile because he
yeah.
just doesn't. But actually that causes various problems because no one can read him and all this kind of stuff. With Horus Aximand, the notion there is obviously much more about identity and understanding. Is that they're all clones, but some of those clones, like Little Horus, look so much like their
Mm,
gene sire, and that is clearly for him psychologically quite an issue,
yeah.
to the point where the one thing that he had that he was pleased with, which is the fact that he looked more so like his father that they called him Little Horus, he hasn't even got that anymore properly.
No.
I mean, it was all about dismantling and remantling him as a character, where
Yeah.
where the fact that he's not his father becomes more evident because he's now not that perfect copy anymore. So there was loads of things going on in there. And it also speaks to the nature of the enemy with their incredibly sharp weapons, and
Mm,
you learn a lot about the enemy because of the way they operate in a different fashion. So the
yeah.
distinction between legions. But yes, for me that was a much more that was less a comment about the universe as it was about with Eisenhorn, where he becomes emblematic of that sort of doer outlook, and much more about that character,
Yeah.
both losing the thing that clearly haunts him and psychologically presses upon him because he picks people to look like him, but also the one thing he's proud of, which is that he looks more like him than anybody
Yeah.
else, and all this kind of stuff. And that is it's the essence of who he is. That he's very
Mm.
I think he simultaneously hates the fact they call him Little Horus because it's so demeaning, but he also loves the fact they call him Little Horus
Yes, there was
because he's yeah. So that it's for that to happen, I think is yeah. Because I'm just cruel, obviously.
but it's cruel with such, oh my God, eloquence and fantastic wordship. But I really, the journey of, the simile of the cocoon being smashed and pinned out as a butterfly echoed in him losing his face and coming
Mhm.
back and rebirth and being born again. And even, there were echoing elements of, so to my mind, he was being haunted by the ghost of Loken. Like, who's
Yes.
there? Who am I seeing? And
Hmm.
when he's actually ambushed by the White Scars, they have whiten themselves, completely powdered and tamped down their red, hidden
Hmm.
under sheets.
Hmm.
These are the ghosts that are following
Oh
him
yeah.
and
Yeah.
eventually, come to strike him and push him into that new life. And I just, I was just thinking, I need to tell Dan that he's doing this, that there are gifts and ghosts and, life cycles. And
Yeah.
I know we talk about it a lot. And in my mind, it would be lovely if you pulled out a big pin board and it had all bits of red string. But I really think, after our conversations about, how you come up with stuff, this is happening now organically. It's part of your flow, and all these synapses are firing in the writing, in the process.
Yes, I would say probably about 80% of it is that kind of like that's the right, it feels like the right thing to do, so I do it. Sometimes, obviously, there's a lot of finessing goes on, but at the same time, I am constantly just randomly on my desk at the moment, like pages and pages of notes of things that
Yeah,
I'm jotting down as I go. I mustn't forget that. That was a really important thing to circle back to, even if it's a peripheral thing. Circle back to it to make sure that we land that moment. So it's
yeah.
not just this thing. But there's a huge amount of and increasingly over the over the years. I mean, I used to do it seat of the pants, and now I'm doing it very carefully, making a note of things because I know it's going to be months before I come back to that, but don't want to forget it. So I
Yeah.
have documents open all the time. So those sorts of things matter. They matter to me because that's the story I want to tell, but they also matter to me because I assume that's the story that people want to read.
Yeah.
And for all that connectivity in the frame of that little story that you're reading there and clearly enjoying, which gratifies me hugely, there are so many more big scale things that, like I said, will come back
Oh,
to land.
I can't wait. It's going to be so good. Oh, I'll be like, well, not ringing because we don't speak on the phone, but I will be like emailing Dan. The revelation
Yes,
is here.
the
But I
revelation.
would,
Yeah.
I would also urge anyone watching, if you can get hold of one of these annotated, where there are, literally margin notes and secret messages.
Yes, I was unsure about that's the Xenos one. I think is that the
It
one behind
is.
you? Yes.
Yes.
Uh,
My
the
first
that
ever Warhammer book, Dan, when we met first.
there. There you go. I think Malleus, the second one's out, and I think Hereticus is because I've done the Hereticus one as well. So they'll all three will be out, and I think they're thinking about doing something. It was that was an experiment where
Yeah.
I was going, does anybody really want to listen to me bang on about why I did various things?
Yes.
Clearly you do, which is lovely. And then those that series has been quite successful, which is lovely to write those things because sometimes footnotes in a book, that kind of director's cut, director's commentary thing, can work really, really well. I can think of several
Yeah.
examples of books which I've loved more because of the comments. And I
Notes.
can think of other books where it's gone, oh, this is just getting in the way. Let me read the book. So I had no idea. I just put down in that, just as I do when I talk to you, the things that seemed to were going on. All
Yeah.
I can say is this is what was going on. This is what I was trying to do. Don't know whether it works or not, but it's
Well, I'm
yeah,
so I'm so jealous. I think if this Warhammer series does happen, there are going to be so many new people coming in to read about this, and they've got these editions now. So
yeah.
could you imagine being able to have that at your fingertips as your first experience? I
There
think
you
that's
go.
lovely. Okay, I'm going to try and just do a couple more questions because I said this would be a short one, but you know me and you, Dan.
There.
There, one of my friends, Will, gave me the most extraordinary of questions, so I should ask it of you. There
Go
is a
on.
scene in the Aeneid
Of
where
course there is.
where a warrior woman, Camilla, I think, is transfixed by the sight of a beautiful man and then struck in the chest by a javelin, dying while it clings in her chest. The sequence going from a sexual awakening to something clinging to her breast and then death, the life cycle of a woman in ancient times. I thought that had a similar vibe to the cocoon smashing scene, and I was wondering if Dan was aware of this in particular or others like it in classical epics and took inspiration. This is what you're igniting. This is why it's so good
Really?
you don't decide to be a cult leader or a dictator, because we're seeing the signs, Dan.
Um, I would I would love to be able to say yes, that was absolutely what I was going for. Not specific, certainly not. I don't remember that. However
Yeah.
many years ago I read that story, that was a specific point of reference. Although, as you know, I read a lot, and I read a lot of mythology, legends, classics, and stuff like that because I love them, and
Mm.
that clearly informs what I do. So I think some of those sort of mythic or legendary callbacks are quite deliberate. I mean, we talked about that with
Yes, Beowulf in
Yeah, Beowulf, yeah, Prospero Burns,
Prosper
and all
Burns, yeah.
yeah, all of those sorts of things. They are either latently there waiting to be used because that's the groove I'm in, or I am deliberately going, I want a flavor of that because then people will know what sort of story this is, and I think
Yeah.
that's yeah. So that's lovely. Yes, I'm going to go and hunt that down now and see.
Yeah, and I think that really pays testament to you saying, I want it to feel like the classical saga. So that's what it's evoking
Yeah,
in reading, that you've
yeah,
achieved it. And then I haven't looked up the opening quote, but it's just really simple and beautiful. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. Litmus
yes.
remarks. So I read that as little Horace does think he is the flower and he does
Mm.
think he's innocent. And it kind of takes this realization that you know, you're on the bad side of things, and then he kind of becomes the snake. But what was your feeling around that quote?
Well, it's partly that. It's also, and I'm gonna kick myself because I'm pretty sure because the other thing about that quote is it is Shakespeare, and I think it's Macbeth. I
Ah,
think it's what Macbeth says to Lady Macbeth before they go and murder Duncan. I'm
ah,
pretty sure that's right. It's definitely Shakespeare, and now I'm doubting myself. But the fact that the quote appears pretending to be a quote from something else is
yeah.
another example of deception and, dare I say it, false faces, which
Oh,
is which is
oh. Oh, it's
that was
just
the idea, is that pretending to like looking like one thing but being something else, or the other way around, or
yeah.
discovering that something is not what it appears to be. Yeah,
Mm.
so that's that. So I put the quote in, and then deliberately, because quite often we have used Shakespearean or other quotes, sort of real world quotes, and then disguise the attributions to go, oh, that's Shakespeare. There's some at the
Yeah.
beginning, I think, of let me think. I think it's The Unremembered Empire, which are clearly quotes from Hamlet, and they talk about sort of Hamlet, and it happens again in Prospero Burns as well.
Mm.
With that one, I just went, yeah, I'm just going to quote Shakespeare completely, but then pretend it isn't.
Yeah.
So it's like, so again, you've got the duplicity that the whole story is about
Oh,
locked in there.
very good. The other notable thing is transhuman dread, uh, and explaining how the feelings that little Horace goes through when he experiences it. I had never seen it explained like that, and it really awoke me.
There
So
you
if they
go.
had an
I
army,
was enormously proud of that. I don't know where it quite came from, but it was something that I felt compelled to express. And that is certainly, I know, if that story is influential in the canon in any way, shape, or form, whatever else it is doing, and you've praised it in all sorts of lovely ways that I'm very grateful for. But there was that encapsulation of transhuman dread that has been sort of run with by everybody. They've gone, oh God, that's the thing.
yes, and
So
I
it was
don't even play
expressing.
I don't even play the game, but it made me understand if my characters were there, this is how we'd all be feeling if we were
Yeah.
mortal. And yeah, I mean, I'm so glad I picked up on that. That was like, I mean, and if people don't believe me, I did a reaction video to this story and I was like, oh my God, transhuman dread. So it's fantastic.
Great, also great band name, I feel.
Yeah. Probably Mike Brooks is probably in a band named that, you know.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
something like that's already going on. So I think I should probably cut our interview down now because I've taken a lot of your time.
that's
But
absolutely fine.
what are the things that you think people will be saying, oh, Mira, you should have asked him X, Y, and Z about?
I don't honestly know.
There's a bit of
I
Abaddon in there.
don't. There's a bit of everything in there. Yeah, it's like a little bit. It's almost like a deleted scene from. It's sort of like a deleted scene from Horus Rising and the early. It's all those things. But I don't know what else I'd say. You've got to remember how long ago I wrote it and how many things I've written since then and how it's
Yeah.
blended into a continuum of story and character. And you say things about it and I go, oh yeah, I did do that, didn't I? Oh crikey. But sort of the idea that I could go back and go, oh, of course, you should have asked me about that
Yeah.
incredibly important thing. And I'm going, there may have been an incredibly important thing that I've completely forgotten about by now. So
Oh,
yeah.
well, thank you so, so much for talking to me about Age of Darkness. I think the next thing we're going to be talking about is Double Eagle,
Oh,
and then Interceptor City. Is that the right
yeah,
one? I think it's
that is
right.
the right one. That's
And
yes,
then
yes.
I don't know if you can see over this shoulder, Dan. Somebody bought me these books. Do you remember
Yes, I do remember those. Yes.
that? So,
They're not Warhammer at all, are they? Yes.
no.
Yes, they are. Yes. That was a
So
long time ago.
I know, and and I do play fighting fantasy, but it reminds me of Kit Williams' The Hunt for the Golden Hare, and the fighting fantasy. So really fantastic. So if any of you find this out there and you've got little gamers growing up, I think they're quite rare, but I thought they were
They
so
are.
lovely and wholesome.
They are. By my
Yeah,
standards.
yeah. There's no beheadings, no
No,
no sausages from the stomach, and yeah,
no.
my shrine to you is growing, Dan. Thank you so, so much for coming on my channel, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, Dan.
This book, it tells of a heresy tale, one of 60 you may have heard of space marines, are they good or bad? It's hard